Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to our 10th grade class and our new unit this time because we're all done with short stories. So, welcome to our second unit, which is going to be on the Greek play Antigone. Now, what we're going to do today is basically just walk you through some preliminary kind of opening notes and questions about both Antigone and its historical context and the stuff that we generally need to know about that context and background before we move into the play, just to get a better understanding of it overall. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to actually read a little bit of or at least talk about the prologue a little bit and answer some questions on the prologue. So, Antigone. Most of us probably have not heard of Antigone. Most of us are usually totally unfamiliar with this name or this story, unless for some reason you were following in ninth grade something like a New York State modules curriculum and you read Oedipus the King. And I used to teach Oedipus the King as one of my options for ninth grade, but I kind of pushed that over to 12th grade recently. So we're generally unfamiliar with this, but that's totally fine. All we need to know, and as you can basically discern from the opening slide there, all we need to know is that to start off with, is that this is a Greek play. Okay, so Antigone is probably one of the most famous Greek plays from the playwright Sophocles, and it's about 2,500 years old or so. And I want us to basically talk about that and that first and foremost, the Greek context and the Greek culture that this play comes out of. So, as the historical context notes teach us, yes, Antigone was written probably around the early 400s BC, and that's right around the time when ancient Greece was at its height. Now, if you're kind of unfamiliar with world history, usually my students are taking this in or reading this in 10th grade when they've already discussed world history, so they need a little bit of a refresher to know where this play is coming from in the context of history. It's coming from basically the peak of Greek civilization, which itself is what precedes the Roman civilization, or at least the height of the Roman civilization. Okay. And what was really remarkable about the ancient Greek civilization is, of course, its heightened, what would you say? Its heightened success in the fields of literature, philosophy, and drama. And it was particularly noteworthy because of its influence on Western thought and imagination, as we wrote here. And it has done so to this very day, okay? Almost more so than really any other ancient culture. And I think the only other culture that really stands as a good, what do you want to call it, contestant, and maybe definitely outweighs the impact of the ancient Greek culture and the Roman culture would be, of course, the Judeo-Christian culture, okay, or the Jewish culture, if you want. But aside from that, the Greeks have really influenced our world and our thought and our creations and our artwork quite significantly. Okay. Now, the ancient Greek culture, what are some things that are noteworthy that we should understand about it moving into the play Antigone? First and foremost, the strict customs about honor. The honor that is due to, first and foremost, the gods, that is due to the guests, either in someone's home or to someone who you are a guest of, right? And also the honor due to the dead. Okay. Now, there's an enormous emphasis, as it says here, on not acting. I like the way this is phrased, not acting as if you were greater or mightier than the gods. Okay. So the Greeks are really consistent, I would say, in their theme of promoting their version of humility in the face of the gods or in the face of divinity. Now, we see that, if you followed us in ninth grade, we definitely talked about that quite extensively in the story of Odysseus. And we can see that basically in every Greek myth, whether it's the Iliad, the Odyssey, the myth of Icarus, the myth of Prometheus, et cetera, et cetera. This comes up again and again and again, that we should not be challenging the gods, that we should be obeying the gods, that we should try to be appeasing to the gods, or at the very, very best, do what we need to do and just hope that they kind of, don't mess with us, right? Now, the same is going to be true in Antigone. We're going to see that there are characters. There is a character who is, at least passively, if not overtly, verbally, kind of practicing some willful ignorance, I would say, about what the gods really want and his place next to the gods, right? There's a lot of arrogance that is on display in this play, and that is the one feature that the Greeks are very almost paranoid about, especially in the face of the gods. We need to bring down the character's hubris, is what it's called, right? The Greeks would have used the term hubris, the pride, the arrogance, the excessive confidence, right? And that particular concept is something that I've told students again and again and again, is one of the very universal concepts in almost all literature, all global literature for the recorded human history, right? We need to be very careful about our arrogance and our boastfulness and our pride, um, because it is an incredibly toxic trait and an incredibly destructive trait, not only to ourselves, but to those around us and to all of our endeavors as well. And we're going to see that play out. We're going to discuss that a little bit more in this play. Now, two questions to consider for your notes. Number one, why do you suspect ancient Greek stories are so popular in Western history 2,500 or so more years after their creation? So in other words, why are we still reading these things? And then number two, what were the values and customs that this culture focused on, and do we see them in our culture as well? So to answer number one, I think these stories are popular probably for two technical reasons. And this is a formulation that I think the philosopher or the writer Horace put down. And it's something that we can continuously articulate whenever we discuss quote unquote older or ancient stories. And it's these two reasons, essentially, these two factors about these stories. Number one is that they are just entertaining, that there's something entertaining about them. Whether that's because of their fantastical qualities, whether that's because of their compellingness, right? The drama that's in them. Like I found myself back when I was teaching Oedipus the King, I found myself watching that play again and again and again. I just really was captivated by it. And that's very typical of the ancient world, of the works of the ancient world. And that's self-evident, right? Because here we are, 2,500 years, reading it again, after this thing has been read millions upon billions of times, essentially, throughout human history. So it has some kind of entertainment value to it. Now, another reason why it's probably like these sort of stories are so popular are because not only of their entertainment, but also because of their educational value, their instructive value. And that's a feature that we've talked about, I think, before, and when we discuss mythology, especially, is because, which the factor is that when we look at a story that has been crafted or composed over 2,000 years ago, and then retold again and again and again throughout human history, we need to, of course, step back and say, well, what is being done there? What are we doing there as a civilization? We see this story and we're kind of lifting it up and we're kind of bringing it back to our memory, or bringing it back at the forefront of our memory for a reason. And I think one of the reasons for that, guys, is because we see some really strong educational value there. If we're looking for what? An answer or a sequence of answers in life about how to live life well, right? How to not suck at life, basically. How to achieve perhaps a goal or like the deep purposes of life. Well, I think that's one of the roles that these stories have, is that we see human beings bringing these stories up again and again and again because we see figures in this story, or we see lessons in this story that speak to that somehow, that kind of tell us, well, here's some piece of information, here's some examples of how you really should maybe act or should not act, if you're trying to actually live life truly well, okay? So I think that's one obvious, or two obvious reasons as to why these things are so popular, okay? And number two is interesting. I usually get a variety of answers from students about this. What were the values and customs that this culture focused on, and do we see them in our culture today? So we know the focuses of ancient Greek culture, right? The honor to the gods, to guests, and to the dead. Do we see honor to the gods today? Well, if you're religious, I mean, sure, of course, to varying degrees, of course, because the Greek gods are very, very different, and the Greek religion is very, very different than the Judeo-Christian religions that we are, predominantly surrounded by today. So the honor that we do, that we were due to those gods, maybe might have been a bit more excessive, might have been a bit more intense or more prevalent to our minds or to our practices than they are today to the Judeo-Christian gods, because a factor of the Judeo-Christian religion that is notably absent from the pagan religions is the overwhelming abundant mercy and forgiveness of the Christian gods, God rather, and we don't usually see that very much in the Greek world, right? So there might have been a much more pious sort of attitude about the gods in the ancient world or in the ancient cultures. Now, when it comes to guests, my students usually admit to not showing or not observing as much honor to guests as we did in the ancient world. And this might be, of course, because we have more abundance nowadays. We don't need to rely on hospitality as much anymore. And of course, to the dead, we definitely have people say that this is very much prevalent and present and visible to us today. We see funerals, we see rituals around people's deaths, we see people, making pilgrimages to people's deaths, people's burial sites, and all this kind of stuff. I think that one's very clearly still in vogue, if you want. And the example I usually give is this notion about the honor due to the dead among the military. So in the ancient world, this need to have honor towards the dead was shown typically even to people who we were fighting against or who we were enemies with. So if Athens goes to war with Sparta, for example, you'd have the battle, but what would typically be the expectation was this idea that, okay, so we battle, and Athenians, now you need to come and collect your dead at the end of the day, and then Spartans, you need to come and collect your dead at the end of the day. It's not a free-for-all battle. We don't just get to keep going and going and going and just kind of like trot in the other bodies underfoot and leave them there for crows and for dogs. We can't do that. That would be breaking the customs of honor and the laws of the gods in the ancient world. So you were expected to provide some either means of burial or either bury them yourself. You were expected to provide this to even your enemies, essentially, to even people that you killed in battle, if there was no one else to bury them for you, okay? Now, do we see that today? To some extent, I think, because again, the example I always give is in the US military, the rules and customs about defiling bodies, okay? Enemy combatants who fall in battle are due some respect in their death, right? We have to do something with their body. We cannot just defile it and kind of leave it there to die, essentially, or what do we call it? Openly defile it, right? I remember there were some court-martialing cases about Marines, I think, that were actively defiling a body when after they killed a terrorist, I think several years ago. So that whole notion of the honor due to the body is still present even to this day, and it was actually present, far before the ancient Greeks, right? We know that very, very clearly from anthropology. So that's some of the culture, right? That's just some of the basic ideas about the culture that are going to be relevant for us in Antigone. Now, the theater itself. Okay, so what do we know? We know that the Greek theater, from our time discussing Shakespeare, that this was an enormous influence on our idea of performative arts today. Now, there's two general genres of Greek theater, of course, the comedy and the tragedy, which we discussed, even though it wasn't a theater production, we discussed that with the Odyssey and the Iliad. So a comedy, of course, is a play or is a story wherein we have a main character begin in a not so great place and then end in a much, much better place, typically with, with a resolution to a long conflict or with a marriage of some sort, right? So that's what we mean by comedy. We don't mean, farcical and comedic. We mean comedy essentially in the way that the struggle and the conflict plays out in the story. Now, more common is, of course, especially the high school students, is, of course, a tragedy, right? The tragic structure, which we're going to explore here in Antigone. And that is, as it says, when the main character begins in a place of sort of a more elevated state of their fortune, right? Kind of a better spot, and then they end the play in a really negative space as a result of usually three different factors. And the three factors I give here are usually the three forms of tragedy that we can see playing out in these stories. The first one, probably the most clear, is when the main character has some sort of flaw in their personality, some sort of hamartia, of course, is the Greek word for that, right? Some sort of sin that leads to their negative fate, right? So usually in the ancient Greek tragedies, that is the sin hubris, right? Of over and excessive arrogance. Okay. Now, that's one possible one. The other one, of course, is when we have what? We have two clear options, essentially. I don't actually think that this one's articulated here. We have two options where we have no real good choice, essentially, when we are presented with a fork in the road in our life, and there's one terrible option and there's another terrible option. We have to basically choose one, right? It's a very typical feature of tragedy. And then, of course, the last one is when we have inevitable conflicts or actions based on poor information that arise based on poor information, right? So the typical sequence with that is that we would have a character who hears a prophecy or hears some piece of information, then acts on it without really waiting or practicing patience or practicing some more wisdom and discernment. And then as a result, them acting too quickly on this piece of information causes something terrible to happen, usually what the prophecy predicted, okay? Now, the structure of Greek plays here is kind of interesting, right? We have, as it says here, a singular tragic hero, kind of broken up, his or her story broken up into 5 scenes or 5 acts, 5 stages, if you want. And the plays here in ancient Greece take place over the span of 24 hours, right? So the play itself is not 24 hours. You don't have to sit there for a whole day. But the plot line within the story takes place from morning to night, right? That's basically a 24-hour play. You're going to get this person's story all encapsulated in that small little period, in that small little scene, okay? Typically, the scenes would play out with 2 to 3 characters on stage, along with the chorus, or the choragos, the scene or the group of characters, the group of actors who would sing in between these stages, in between these scenes, and give the audience some reflection and some commentary on what was going on in the play. Now, that character or that group of characters, the chorus, would usually also be characters within the play as well. So typically taking the role of like senators or statesmen or elderly figures kind of surrounding the characters as well. So that's general Greek theater. Now, number one, what is one disadvantage we have when reading a play in class that the original audience did not have? Well, there's at least 2 major disadvantages. The first one, of course, is the fact that we are reading a play, which is wrong and dysfunctional in and of itself, right? We should not be reading a play. We should be watching the play Antigone, okay? So, perfect world scenario. We would all get on a plane. We would fly over to either ancient Greece or we would fly over to Sicily and find one of those beautiful amphitheaters. We would grab a bunch of grapes and olives and, bread and all this kind of stuff and just sit there on a nice, beautiful day or a nice, beautiful evening. And we would sit and we would enjoy a production of the play Antigone. And we would sit there and watch it. And then we would come back into class and then analyze it and discuss it. Okay. Now, that's one disadvantage. Now, another major disadvantage, of course, is that we are viewing the proto storytelling. It's 2,000 plus years after this form of storytelling was more prevalent. So, for example, most of my students are not used to watching just 2 people talk in one scene for 5 or 6 minutes, right? That's just not normal for us. We live in a culture where our art is usually much more peppered with scenes, peppered with events, with action, with extreme drama and characters and all this kind of stuff. Whereas in this story, we get kind of a very, very condensed form of drama that we're able to just see unfold itself on stage, essentially, which is a blessing and a curse, actually, right? That is a disadvantage that we're not usually used to seeing this sort of thing. But I think if we can, again, lift the veil and the kind of expectations that everything must be as we expect it and must be as we like it. If we can drop that a little bit and be a little bit more open, we might actually really enjoy or be able to kind of uncover why this play is so enjoyable, why this form of drama was so enjoyable as well. Okay. Why do you suspect that tragedies are so popular in literature and history? Okay, so we list out all the ones that we usually throw at you as English teachers, right? It's a cliche joke, but we really do have you read tons and tons of tragedies. Why is this? Well, my students come up with a number of different answers to this question, and one of my favorite ones is that these tragedies, of course, like we discussed earlier, may help educate us about how to not follow in these characters' footsteps. Okay, so education is one major idea as to why these things are so popular. Another one is some form of catharsis, right? Is that these provide us some kind of emotional release or some kind of emotional connection even with the characters on stage, right? So we're able to see, for example, like, wow, like this is, um, this is just like what I'm going through. This is just like, or very similar to what I'm going through in some level, at some basic fundamental level. This is kind of the same experience I'm having in life. Because life, as we've discussed before, has major tragic elements to it. And so humans have constantly been, grappling with that, with the tragedy of death, the tragedy of disease, the tragedy of our ignorance, the tragedy of our own moral failures. This has been something we struggle with again and again and again. And when we see characters struggling with it and maybe even overcoming it to some degree, or at least coming to terms with it, we sort of have an emotional release as a result of watching that and seeing that. Okay. I think those are some of the major reasons why this genre is in fact so popular. Now, we can kind of run through this really quickly. I'm not going to do this in much detail because Antigone is not what you would expect a typical mythic story to be. The gods actually don't directly appear in this story. They're actually quite indirectly there, but they're there. Their presence is very clearly shown, or at least referenced at least twice in this play. And do we need to know much about Greek polytheism to understand this? No, not really, unless you missed our discussions on mythology in ninth grade and all this kind of stuff. All we need to know is that, yes, the Greeks follow a polytheistic religion, and they have one supreme god, Zeus, who is the kind of arbiter of fate and arbiter of justice with all the other gods, or through all the other gods as well. Their myths tend to be, as it says here, interconnected stories. Okay, so there might be, for example, the Odyssey, right, which we read last year. The Odyssey is a myth or is a story that's connected with the story of ancient Troy, which is connected with the story of Achilles, which is connected with the story of Agamemnon and his family. So we have all these different stories kind of playing together. They're interconnected. And they operate within, if you want to call it, like a mythic universe, okay, a universe of stories. Now, the obvious analogy that I usually give here is the Marvel universe as well. So Marvel stories, and let's use the Avengers films as an example. Marvel had, its first Avengers film come out after it had already established stories of the Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, et cetera, et cetera. And those stories were already kind of independent, if you want, but they were very clearly connected to each other. And then, of course, they weave together into some major epic, and then they kind of weave back up apart. And then we have like different stories of, Hulk going off and doing this thing, Thor going and doing this thing, and we have those stories connecting with other ones that we have. That is exactly how the Greek myths would have operated, right? So we would see, for example, the story of Antigone and her family would connect with other myths that we had as well. So, for example, the myth of Oedipus, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, because of this canon of mythology that existed, we had an enormous array of stories and characters that contemporary Greek writers could have chose from to do what with, to reboot and redepict those stories. So, for example, when we read the play Oedipus the King, if you ever do read the play of Oedipus the King, it's important to remember that the Greeks knew his story before they even saw the play. So they sit down and they know what's going to happen. They know, okay, this is Oedipus' story. We're going to go see this. It's kind of like when we sit down and go see, for example, like if you go rewatch the story of Iron Man, it's like, you know how this is going to end. You know exactly what's going to happen, but we're watching it be retold. That's essentially what the Greeks were doing here, what our playwright Sophocles was doing. He was taking, I like Antigone's story. I want to take her and extend her out a little bit and kind of show us the more details and the more kind of intimate characterization of her as she's struggling with the story that we know. So it's not uncommon, again, when we see this nowadays, especially like with I think the Chosen series, right, about the Bible, with the Rings of Power series and the Lord of the Rings. You take a piece of literature that is actually quite bare bones to some extent, and you actually kind of stretch it out and put more flesh on it and more detail into it that is consistent with those original bones, those original ideas. That's exactly what Sophocles is doing here with Antigone. Now, again, why were the Greeks and their culture so fixated on mythic and fantastical elements? Why are we? We can copy and paste the answer essentially for ancient stories in general. We really like mythic stories because they are very entertaining typically, and they're very colorful, right? They're much more colorful than more hyper realistic stories. And they're also very educational to some degree. And I will repeat the Joseph Campbell quote that I've mentioned in the Odyssey unit last year, which is that myths are a metaphor for the experience of life. Okay. Now, if we are able to understand and accept that, I think that that makes myths much, much more rich for us because we can see our own problems metaphorically, or at least symbolically in a very bare bones or very kind of like profound artistic way, being redepicted in front of us, essentially. And we can kind of understand them more and more and maybe get more encouragement to kind of conquer them and address them in the stories in front of us. And number two, what are some modern equivalents to large? Yeah, this is the one that we just talked about, right? The obvious example would be the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel Comic Universe, right? The DC Universe, all these sort of things, Star Wars, right? All of these stories, all these interconnected, large, stories, Lord of the Rings as well. These, of course, are universes of stories that multiple authors can come in and take pieces of them and kind of do some other kind of artwork with them, right? That's very typical of how we need to understand the Greek canon of mythology. Now, Sophocles, our author, don't really know much about him, aside from, like I said, that he is the second most famous Greek playwright. He wrote over 120 plays. We only have 7, right? So, let's shed some tears about that. Continuing with our Marvel analysis, our Marvel, analogy, that would be like what? You have the entire Marvel canon, right? All up until like Endgame. And whoever, discovers the Marvel works in the future, 3,000 years in the future, only can find Ant-Man. That's essentially what it's like for us. We can only see 7 of this guy's plays. We don't know what the other 113 were. Now, he of course won because being the second best playwright. He usually won the Dionysian contests in ancient Athens, right? So he was usually very, very celebrated there. And his most famous plays that we have, of course, are the Theban trilogy, which tell, as it says, the history of Oedipus and his children. Now, really quickly, let's run through the story of Oedipus and his children, okay? So Oedipus's backstory, of course, he has a very unique sort of upbringing because his parents, the king and queen of Thebes, hear a prophecy one day that basically says their child is doomed to kill his father and marry his mother and kind of have incestuous children with her. Now, the parents of Thebes, right, the rulers of Thebes, hear this, they freak out, and they try to avoid their fate. They try to kind of undermine the prophecy. And so they throw their child out in the wilderness. Very typical, practice of the ancient world. And a farmer discovers the child, takes pity on him, brings him to a neighboring city, gives him to the king and queen there who wanted a child. He is then named Oedipus, okay, for his swollen feet, and he's raised believing that that was his mother and father, okay? Now, later on, as he grows up, he basically hears that prophecy again at a party. He hears the prophecy that, these are not actually your parents, and, you're doomed to kill your father and marry your mother, all this kind of stuff. And so as a result, once again, he, or at least someone in the story, tries to avoid that fate. He runs away. And on the road, he has, an interaction with someone, some old guy that's in a procession that's following him that, causes a little bit of road rage in everybody. And Oedipus, long story short, kills the guy. He goes to a city. The city, of course, is Thebes, and he realizes that the city is under attack by a sphinx, all this kind of stuff. He defeats the sphinx, and as a reward, the queen, who is somehow now husbandless, she doesn't know where her husband is, decides to marry this young, successful hero. And they get married, and for several years, they have at least 4 children. Now, Oedipus's play, okay, the first play in this trilogy, begins after all that. And it begins with Oedipus now ruling Thebes after he explains, as it says, how he left Corinth, okay, his original, his place of where he was raised, after hearing a prophecy that he would kill his dad, marry his mom, kills on the road, and he has 4 children with her, all this kind of stuff. And then what happens? That day of the play, the day that the play depicts essentially, goes on an investigation to see, who killed the king of this city that I'm in, Thebes, trying to solve the murder of that. But of course, in solving that murder, he slowly but surely understands who he is and what he has done. And as a result, he is so appalled at what he has done and just can't bear to look on the products of his sins anymore, and he, of course, blinds himself. He stabs his eyes out with his mother's, I think, clothing pins, and he walks around, and he has to leave the city now blind and in infamy, essentially, repulsive to everyone. And his daughter Antigone chooses to follow him into the wilderness and to care for him while he is there. Okay. Now, of course, we've mentioned our titular character, Antigone, but let's hold off on her for a minute. Now, number one, a consideration question here is what really causes Oedipus's fate, or his tragedy rather, is it fate? In other words, is it the gods kind of organizing this, or is it his own arrogance and blindness? Welcome to the debate, because it could be both. You could say it's entirely his fault, right? He acted the way that he did. He was very, very bold, brash, didn't pay attention to the signs, and he could have acted very differently, and he didn't, right? So partially his fault, or maybe entirely his fault. And you could also say, yeah, but the gods called out that this was going to happen in the beginning. They kind of set it up for him to happen, essentially. They knew how he would react, and they still did it. You could say that that's their fault entirely, or you could, of course, say that it's a blend or somewhere in between on the spectrum, right? It's a very annoyingly nebulous and difficult thing to understand. And of course, what we're really debating in that discussion, guys, is who is responsible for our greatest failures. We are fundamentally responsible for a lot of the things that we do, but there are other factors at play as well that are guiding us and pushing us and pulling us in other directions. So we need to understand the balance between those things. Now, number two, what universal fears and conflicts do we see reflected in the story of Oedipus that make it such a lasting and horrific tale? Okay. What do we see? We see universal fears and conflicts, right? Now, of course, this is when, students will say, well, I don't really want to murder my dad. I don't really want to, marry and sleep with my mom. I don't want to do this kind of stuff. I don't see any connections here. Sure, sure, sure. And this is where we need to adopt that more broad kind of universal mythic interpretation of things. Let's look at the process of Oedipus killing his father. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know how far this conflict was going or where this conflict would eventually lead him. Are we afraid of this conflict with our father? Are we afraid that we are going to get in such a conflict with either our father or both of our parents or one of our parents to such a degree that we're going to kill them necessarily? No, I don't think that's very uncommon. I think it's what's more likely is we're going to kill the relationship. That's what's going to happen that we are afraid of. We are, I think, at some deep level afraid, or at least we should be afraid, that the conflicts within our family will reach such a boiling point that we will eventually kill those relationships, and they will be very difficult, if not impossible, to amend in this life ever again. Okay, so that is something that Oedipus is very clearly ashamed of, is the conflict with his father. And what about the mother, right? Again, are we literally afraid that we're going to wake up and sleep with our mother and have 4 kids? I don't think so. I think, unless you're Sigmund Freud, go take psychology and go look at our Freudian lens about that. But still, no, I don't think that that's the major fear here. I think the fear is of some weakening of our own self or of our own development if we remain too attached to our mother, okay? Now, or if we blur the lines with our relationship with our mother too much, okay? So if you look at characters or people that we know or ourselves who rely too much on a parent figure and try to stay too close to a parent figure so that they are not actually growing and independent and developing themselves, that's one of the major fears I think that Oedipus' story is playing on. This idea that you will have been under the thumb or been kind of so attached to your parents for so long that you're going to wake up one day and realize, oh my God, like I haven't really developed at all, and I'm essentially a grown man child, and I'm useless and I'm pathetic and all this other kind of stuff, right? So the fear of over sheltering, over protecting children, I think, is very clearly on display in that story. All right. Now, really quickly, Oedipus at Colonus. Now, this is something that we don't really need to know too much about because it's usually the middle child of the Theban trilogy. Oedipus's sons, Eteocles and Polynices, are left in Thebes to rule with their uncle Creon. Okay. Now, after they have witnessed what happened to Oedipus, okay, so the boys stay there, and I think also Ismene, the younger of the 2 girls, stays there. But Antigone goes out, with Oedipus to try to help him in the wilderness. While he's away, a civil war breaks out between Eteocles and Polynices that. With the latter overthrowing Creon, with the latter wanting to overthrow Creon and be the king, okay? And how does this end up playing out? Well, before the conflict resolves, Oedipus dies out in the wilderness while he's in exile with Antigone. And he's actually, interestingly enough, raised up to the level of godhood. He's blessed, or if anything, he's blessed by the gods for enduring the sufferings of his life, right? So he's endured the sufferings and the pain that he has basically caused or brought down upon himself well, right? The gods like the way that he's bared and he's borne his, his trials and tribulations. So they bless him. They kind of ascend him into the underworld, or down to the underworld, if you want, okay? Now, the actual play of Antigone begins with what? With Antigone, either re-entering or kind of coming into the play and learning what? That both Eteocles, her brothers, and Polynices have killed each other in battle. However, the king Creon, who is now the king, right, only allows the former, that is Eteocles, to be buried properly. And he is going to make the other one, Polynices, lay out and be unburied, okay, be a feast for crows and dogs. That is the opening of the play. Now, of course, we can see some of the relevant points of Greek culture playing out there, right? The need for the honor of a dead body, the need for the honor of the gods above and beyond, necessarily the rules of law. So the conflict begins essentially with Antigone having to decide what to do, right? The play is going to open, as we're going to see in a second, with her and Ismene coming and discussing what to do about their dead brother, Polynices, okay? Now, there are three major themes that I want us to be tracking and discussing in this play that I want you to be at least attentive to as we read through this play. The first one is this role or this relationship between the quote-unquote laws of men and then the laws of God, right? These two different levels of moral behavior, right? The laws and the demands and the expectations of human beings and our laws and our systems versus these kind of deep and profound eternal laws of the gods, okay? Now, that's one major one. Another one is the cost and the price of arrogance, right? Of tyrannical and arrogant and stubborn behavior, right? We're going to see that very clearly on display in this play as well, right? What happens if you choose to remain willfully blind, to remain stubborn, and to remain kind of clinging to your own authority and power? What happens to you, and what is going to happen to your family as well, to those that you love, if you remain this way? Okay? And of course, finally, kind of connecting back with the history of Antigone and her family, is this theme of inherited tragedy. What is the effect of having tragedies within your family on you, essentially? How is it that we, in some sense, inherit the dysfunctions and the curses and the tragedies that our family either endures or produces, okay? That's something we're going to talk about very, very clearly with Antigone as well. All right, so now, and we're not actually going to only consider those questions. I asked you, and I think in our notes to answer those, to give me some of your initial thoughts. And I don't want to give you all the answers just yet, right? We're going to read first before we actually go through those in full detail. So the prologue of Antigone, we're going to discuss this very, very briefly. And I'm not going to read through the entire play with you. There's other ways to do that, and I don't actually have the text online yet for you, but the version that I'm reading is this one, which is the Prestwick House Literary Touchstone Classic, right? It's a pretty simple, unabridged translation of Antigone. It does not use overly archaic and overly classical language, so if you're a little bit frustrated with that, if you're really, really anti-Shakespeare and all this kind of stuff, then you might really like this because it's quite accessible in its language. So if you open up to, I think it's on this version, page 13, the play begins with Antigone coming out and asking Ismene if she has heard the king's new edict. But in doing so, she describes the evils perpetrated by her father and how their lives have, as a result, been what? Nothing mad or shameful or dishonorable that is among any of your or my sorrows, okay? In other words, that she is familiar with an existence of dishonor, shame, sorrow, horrific depression, all this kind of stuff, this terrible life. Now, and Ismene basically echoes this as well. And the question at number one is asking, well, it is described this way, but something we need to consider, of course, is why, to connect back to our themes. Well, of course, because of their father. Their father was an incredibly dysfunctional person, an incredibly negative figure, an incredibly shameful figure. And that reputation, at the very least, has followed the girls. So the reputation that these girls are products of incest is in and of itself a problem. But I think at a more deep level, guys, what they're reflecting on there is the sense that, our father's dysfunction, the fact that he was not a good father, overall, the fact that, he caused this, this conflict that just destroyed our entire home life, essentially, and forced us to deal with that, forced us to have to contend with that, as opposed to, enjoy life at some deeper level. That is a curse, okay? That is a form of inherited tragedy. So we need to kind of suffer because of our father's sins now, okay? So that is on display right off the bat. And of course, we learn what has happened to Polynices, right? She talks about on page 14, how Eteocles is going to be given all the different pomp and circumstance and burial, but Creon has decreed that, according to Antigone, it's specifically for her and Ismene, that he is not supposed to be buried. Because why? Because he essentially rebelled against Creon, okay? So Creon is saying what? That this guy tried to overthrow me and my city and all of us, so he is dishonored, and he does not have the privilege of being buried as per the gods' laws, okay? Now, Antigone says to her sister around line 35, which, by the way, is probably the best way to kind of track the sequences or track the lines in the quotes in this story. Not necessarily the page numbers, and there's no real technical act, like sections where the acts are labeled here, but the line numbers are all pretty consistent. So around line 35, Antigone says, what? Yes, the penalty of death is public stoning, right? So if you do bury Polynices, you're going to be executed publicly. She says, there you have it, Ismene. And soon you will show how nobly you honor your noble birth, okay? Obviously foreshadowing that Antigone has a plan here. I think she's telling us, like, here's the setup, right? Here's what's going on with Polynices and everybody. And here's my plan, Ismene. And of course, Ismene, senses that something bad is coming. Like, what are you talking about, sis? What do you want to do here? And she asks on line 45, will you lift the corpse with this very hand? Ismene, of course, says, you want to bury him, although it's forbidden in this city? She says, I'll bury my brother, your brother too, though you refuse. I'll not be found a traitor. Madwoman, even though Creon forbids it, he has no right, Antigone says, he has no right to keep me from my own. Okay, so we see here an immediate, decisive kind of characterization of Antigone. She is very willing to defy the king, to defy the state, to defy, the patriarchy, if you want, and say, no, I am going to follow what? The laws of the gods. I'm going to follow what I believe to be right, what I know to be right, and what Creon, whatever comes as a result of Creon's dictation or dictates, let it come, right? Even if it's death. Now, Ismene just goes off on this entire tirade, after line 50. She goes, no, think my sister how our father died, hated, infamous, and offenses. She's saying, like, look, our family's been terrible, everything's been awful, and now you're basically going to do all this. It's for what? It's for excess of things is nonsense, right? To do things, excessive things is nonsense, right? This is excessive, this is extreme, is what Ismene is thinking here. Now, she goes on before that to actually say, what? Consider that we were born women, proving that we should not fight with men, and that we are ruled by more powerful people and must obey them, even in more painful things. So in other words, she's kind of, internalizing a little bit of sexism here. She says, we're just women, we have to follow men's rules, we're weak, we can't really do much, right? This is let's just yield, basically. But she says, what? Therefore, I ask forgiveness to those below. In other words, the spirits and the gods of the underworld. I ask forgiveness of them, as I am forced to do in these matters, and yield to those who walk with authority. I have to yield, I have to bend. I'm going to ask God's forgiveness, but I have to do this, okay? So what does Antigone respond with? She says, I would not order you, and if you changed your mind, what? If you change your mind now, I would not have you do it with me. Be whatever you want. I will bury him. It seems fair to me to die doing it. I will lie dear to him, the one dear to me, a holy outlaw, since I must please those below a longer time than people here. For I shall lie there forever. You, though, dishonor the gods as commands if you wish. Okay. So, what do we see about Antigone here? She's not afraid of death. And she holds the gods' laws as maximally important here, okay? As the pinnacle of importance. Now, I want to explain this like I do in class pretty typically. There's two ways that I can explain this. Now, the first way is in a sort of technical way, which she articulates here. Technically speaking, what is better for you to do? If you adopt Antigone's worldview, right, the worldview of a religious person, essentially, if you adopt the religious worldview and believe in life after death and believe in the idea of punishment and reward after death, all this kind of stuff, what should your primary concern be? It should be on how to attain that reward, right? How to basically ensure that reward in some kind of simplistic sense. Now, Antigone says, I'm going to try to please those below, in other words, the gods below, because I'm going to be with them forever, right? Do I really need to worry about pleasing Creon so much, and then you, by extension, Ismene? No, because you guys are only around what? You're only around temporarily, right? We're going to be together in the afterlife, but like you're not going to have authority over me in the afterlife. It's going to be the gods. So, translate that to modern day kind of Judeo-Christian language. Should you follow God's teachings and Jesus's teachings and all this kind of stuff? But except when, authority figures and parents and friends and all this kind of stuff don't want you to, that doesn't make any sense because you are essentially going to be with God for eternity. And you're going to have an eternal life, essentially. So you should be more concerned about what ensures that life is being lived out properly, or that life is going to be pleasant, let's say. You should be less concerned, therefore, with what's going to make life most pleasant here, okay? So in other words, Antigone recognizes that there is, again, with this eternal perspective, there are greater things to fear than this present discomfort, which includes death, by the way, right? Now, in a more spiritual sense, that's the technical explanation that she provides. In a more spiritual sense, in a more poetic sense, and she discusses this too, it is harmful to your actual self, to your actual life, to be dishonorable, okay? And I usually, for my students, I draw out the lines in the graph of a bios and zoe life, okay? So life, what does this mean? If we translate it into Greek, we think bios, right? We think vertical life, right? You're 4, you're 5, you're 6, you're 7, you're 8, you're 80, you're 90, you die, okay? Physical life. That is one way that we can be concerned about our life, right? There's another Greek word for life, of course, which is zoe, which refers to this more spiritual life, this more kind of substantial character, psychological, mental, spiritual life. And I usually show that as a vertical line. Well, what's that mean? Like, what does it mean for that to increase? And we articulate this in class, and I usually boil it down to what? A maximally developed zoe life will yield or kind of show what signs? Someone who is joyful, someone who is deeply healthy, deeply at peace, who is wise, who is virtuous, who is just kind of enjoying the fullness of life in all of its riches and all of its kind of internal bliss, essentially. Whereas someone who is weak in their Zoe life will have the exact opposite, right? So they'll be in despair, they'll be miserable, they'll be, self-destructive, suicidal, all this kind of stuff. Well, which of those is more important, essentially, therefore? Well, I think anyone with any technical sense can obviously see, well, I want that Zoe stuff, right? You can see very clearly that bios is important, right? Like we don't want bios to be cut short, at age 5, but if you're going to live to the age of 100 and your Zoe life is just going to go like this and just kind of slowly diminish, what's the point, essentially? What's the point of living, therefore? So Antigone is showing here her priorities towards that more honorable, that more Zoe-centered life. She cares more about her moral character than she does her physical bodily health. Okay. And that's why there's the two reasons why, that more poetic reason and that more technical reason. And she explains this to Ismene. Ismene recognizes it to some degree, but she, as she was saying, she just can't bring herself to defy people or men or the king yet. Okay, she's going to try to struggle with this as she goes on. So I think it's unfair to characterize Ismene, by the way, as a complete coward and a complete useful character and a useless character, and as a complete, antithesis to Antigone's character. That's not fair, right? She is a foil to Antigone's character. She struggles with this idea of what to do in this situation, in this tragic situation. What should we do? And Antigone, again, is a foil to Ismene because she shows us the decisiveness, the kind of, brutish certainty that she has, which is correct, I think. I think that's the main thesis of this whole play, that she is right in wanting to follow the gods' laws instead of the stupid laws and the kind of irreverent laws of her uncle, the king. Now, her last lines here, by the way, on line 95, kind of wrap this up really nicely. She says, if you say this, you will be hateful to me, okay? In other words, like if Ismene is still trying to dissuade her from burying Polynices, or at least trying to give him some burial and funeral rituals. And Antigone says, if you say this, you will be hateful to me, and the dead will hate you always, justly, okay, rightly. But let me and my foolish plans suffer this terrible thing, for I shall succumb to nothing so awful as a shameful death. Okay, so she is saying here, shut up, Ismene. I'm going to try it. Even if I'm going to fail fundamentally in doing it, I have to try it. Because if I just cowered away and let my own brother be defiled, be dishonored, let the gods' laws be destroyed and be, spat on by my uncle, I would then what? Die shamefully. Okay, I will die a coward. I will die, in that Zoe sense, right? I will not have any true character to stand on once I reach into the next life. Okay, and she shows us here that, as I ask my students, that there are some deaths that are worse than others, right? Are there deaths that you would prefer as opposed to other deaths? Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious, right? The examples I can have are abound, right? Would you prefer to die, for example, dying of cancer in the hospital alone with none of your family around you, with all of them hating you essentially, or at least trying their best not to hate you as you're dying? Or would you rather die surrounded by loved ones, with them outpouring their love for you as you end your life, essentially? Would you rather die being someone who is saving a child from a burning home or a violent act of somebody, or would you rather die being the person who's trying to commit violence on a child, right? That is the distinction between an honorable and a dishonorable death. As Antigone says, I'll choose the honorable death, thanks. Okay, good. All right, so that's the prologue. That's basically the intro. And the questions here, again, I think they're pretty simple. They're pretty straightforward. We didn't cover them explicitly, all of them at least. We know what Antigone is determined to do. How does Ismene respond to this? We talked about that a little bit. How does Antigone characterize her sister, right? That's a little bit more specific if you want to get deeper into the text there. What is Antigone not afraid of? Well, obviously, she's not afraid of death. Why might she not be afraid? Well, we just discussed that in a number of different ways, right? So she's afraid of something, but she's afraid of the proper things, right? She's afraid of being dishonorable. She's afraid of pissing off the gods in the afterlife. She's afraid of that sort of stuff. She's not afraid of the kind of petty human wrath of her uncle. Now, one final note, and then we will end. You'll notice here that the major form of tragedy that is on display in this story, at least in the prologue, is that second form of tragedy that we discussed, where we are presented with two options that are both equally terrible, right? There's no good option here. And you have a character basically wrestling at some level with which way to go. And that, I think, is the fundamental tragedy of Antigone, is that she is placed in this dysfunctional situation, which she has inherited from her family, and that she's suffering now under with her uncle. And she is trying her best to be a good, honorable person. Unfortunately, doing so will then lead to her death. Okay. And that's the tragedy fundamentally of Antigone, I think. Okay, so there's an intro to the story. There's the prologue of the play. Next time, we will dive into probably the first two scenes and discuss those in some detail. Until then, have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.